Hey listeners, this is Peter and welcome back to the History Shorts, your daily, short-format, history-themed variety show and weekly conversation series with the leading voices in history today. Today's conversation is brought to you by thecollector.com, the ultimate online destination for anyone passionate about art, history, and culture. Beautifully curated, easy to read, and perfect for history nerds who want reliable, inspiring content without the fluff. Thecollector.com is just waiting to be discovered. Today's guest is Steve Kemper, the author of Our Men in Tokyo, a gripping, deeply researched account of the final decade of diplomacy between the United States and Japan before Pearl Harbor. At the center of Kemper's book is Joseph C. Grew, America's ambassador to Japan from 1932 to 1941, a man who watched a nation radicalize from the inside, and who warned Washington again and again that war was coming, and believed that diplomacy still had one last chance to change history's course. Our Men in Tokyo isn't just a biography or a prelude to Pearl Harbor. It's a story about missed signals, political pressure, internal divisions, and the limits of diplomacy when ideology and militarism take hold. Steve Kemper is an award-winning journalist and historian whose work brings forgotten figures and overlooked moments back into focus. A quick word from our sponsors. Steve, welcome to History Shorts.
Thanks for inviting me.
So how do you go about finding your topics, and how did you go about stumbling onto this particular book about Our Man in Tokyo?
Well, this one was so much easier than some of the other ones where I have to cast around for months and months and months to find a subject and make sure it's going to work. This one, I read a book by Eric Larson called The Beast in the Garden, and it was about the U.S. ambassador to Germany in the early 1930s when Nazism was just getting started, and his response to that and the U.S. response to that. It was a fascinating book about a cultured, civilized society about to go nuts. And I thought, that when I finished it, I thought, well, I wonder who Our Man in Tokyo was. It was just that simple. I looked it up in Wikipedia. Joseph Grew. He was there for 10 years. He kept extensive diary and clips, and he's got. So I thought, well, as a historian, as you know, and a writer, those primary sources are gold. So it was very promising right from the beginning, and nobody had written about him for a long time. There's a great biography of him that covers his entire diplomatic career, which was long. But it was published in the early 1960s, I believe. So anyway, there was an opportunity for a book about just this part of his career, and I jumped on it.
So you portray Joseph Grew as someone that saw this storm coming, but just couldn't stop it. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, sure. I'll take it from a couple of different angles. First of all, an ambassador is really never going to be able to stop a war that's, especially when it's against a regime that's intent upon having one. And the Japanese militarists were absolutely, I don't think the war could have been stopped. Grew never gave up. I mean, to the very end, the night before Pearl Harbor, he was still working on the emperor to try to get him to stop the war that he could see coming. But if somebody's intent upon having a war, diplomacy is not going to stop them. That's one of the lessons of this book. It was one of the hard lessons for Grew. He felt like he was a failure. He started a book, in fact, about his time in Japan, and he called it Failure of a Mission. In my view, he was the best man we could have possibly had there at the time, but you can't stand up against fanaticism, irrationality, determination to expand. Diplomacy won't work.
What kind of man was Grew? I assume, as you're doing this, you get to really know this man, not just as a diplomat, but as a man. You said he was the right man for this job. What kind of man was Grew? Who was he?
He was in some ways a typical product of the diplomatic corps at that time. He graduated from Harvard. He grew up in Boston on Beacon Hill. He was from a wealthy family who expected him to go into business or banking, and his family was appalled when he said, no, I'm going to go into the State Department, not State Street. So, because he wanted to serve his country, he wanted to the foreign interest of his country, the foreign affairs of his country. He thought it would be an adventure, and it was. And he was completely devoted to the idea of diplomacy, and helped to bring in the modern foreign service as we now know it, because there was no such thing at that time. It was all just patronage jobs. There were no professionals. He helped to professionalize the foreign service, although, of course, as we know it, there's still a lot of patronage ambassadorships out there. And he was adamantly against that because he said this is a serious job. It should be done by serious, trained people. So that was one key thing about him. And he had a philosophy of diplomacy that he developed over the course of many years. And the first one was that you respect the culture where you're and learn about it to the one where you're going to be assigned. You have to respect them. Second, you have to try to look at things from their perspective. Otherwise, you're never going to be able to find the compromise, the enlightened self-interest that can bind the two countries together. He called himself an interpreter between governments. I'm representing the U.S. to you, and I will represent you to the U.S. And he also was convinced that personal relationships mattered a lot in diplomacy, so that you didn't insult your hosts, for instance. You got to try to get to know them. You worked behind the scenes. If an ambassador is doing his job, you never hear about it. So those were some of the principles that he believed in.
Yeah, I like that fact. I actually put that in my notes, that Grew believed that personal diplomacy still mattered in this age of ideology and militarism that he was surrounded by.
Yeah, and it turned out that he was wrong, that personal relationships aren't enough. The Japanese respected Grew because he respected them, and they listened to him more than they would have to most other representatives that we could have had there. But they didn't listen to him enough to change their policies. He couldn't do it by the force of friendship or personality. And he really tried. He was charming. He was gregarious. He entertained them. He was one of the few embassies in Tokyo to invite at least half of his guests to all of his fancy dinners and luncheons were Japanese. He was amused that the other embassies in Tokyo rarely invited a Japanese. And he thought, well, what are you doing here? How are you collecting information? How are you making friends? And how are you going to find the levers of power and know which ones to push?
I guess as a follow-up question, Grew repeatedly warned Washington about Japan's political situation and radicalization. In this research, where did you see the biggest disconnect between diplomats on the ground, meaning him, and the policymakers back home?
Oh boy, that's a big can of worms. He felt like, and he called himself the man on the spot. And he felt that the people in Washington, principally Secretary of State Hull and his principal Far Eastern advisor, Stanley Hornbeck, should be listening to him and taking him seriously because he had contacts on the ground. He heard things that they would not have access to. Well, as the 30s went on and the Japanese kept violating every possible diplomatic overture and law about governance and territory, as they got more and more greedy and fanatical, they listened less and less to Grew. They said, we don't care what you're hearing there. We have to deal with policy, and we have to direct that policy towards what they're doing. And Grew would say, well, but I know that if we talk to this fellow and we push on this button and we try to go flank on this way, that maybe we can make some headway. And they would say, thank you very much, and we're going to do what we want to do. It was very frustrating for him. On the other hand, Hull and Hornbeck, especially as the 30s went on, had very good points. You couldn't trust the Japanese. Grew would say they promised this, or they say they'll do this if we do that. And Hull and Hornbeck said, but they never do. They always break their word. Every time they promise something, they go back on it. So how can you trust them? You are a victim of you've gone native. That's what they said, to him. And you don't know what you're talking about. You become sympathetic with the people that you should be more skeptical about, which I think is a canard. He was always skeptical. He always presented both sides. He said, this may not happen, but if we try this, it might work. And he's been criticized by historians as being an appeaser and not quite knowing what's going on. It's not true. He was absolutely, from the beginning, he was adamant that the military was running the Japanese government, and that's who the problem was. And he never gave that up, but he also never stopped trying to soften it and get around it.
Japan is, and he shows this, and he repeats this all the time, that Japan is internally divided rather than monolithic. How does that complicate the common narrative that the war between the U.S. and Japan was inevitable by pointing out that Japan itself was divided?
This brings up one of the reasons why I wanted to do the book. I knew very little about Japan before Pearl Harbor. And every American knows Pearl Harbor, and we know about the Pacific War. We know some of the basics. But what was going on in Japan at the time? Now, like most Americans, I was ignorant about that. Ignorance excites me as a state of being because then I can find things out and learn. And I was shocked by what I found out about Japan. It was a very divided society. There were people in Japan who wanted to take Japan back to the feudal hierarchy and have their divine leader, Emperor Hirohito, who came from the sun goddess. That's where everything emanates from him. And then there were the other people in Japan who had made Japan the most dynamic, powerful country in Asia by that point, by adopting Western ideas about education, industrialization, politics, government, science, military. So there were these streams that were clashing in Japan constantly. That's why there were all these assassinations there, the coup attempt. Japan was trying to figure out what to do. And Gru said, we can take advantage of this if we go about it the right way. We have to cultivate the people who are opposing the fanaticism. That became harder and harder to do. So he never accepted the idea that war was inevitable, but he also was pretty clear that it was probably going to come, and the best we could do was slow it down.
Yeah, this haunting theme of dangerous and dramatic suddenness of it all, right? And when you talk about Pearl Harbor, how much of Pearl Harbor do you think was a miscalculation versus a deliberate gamble by Japan's leadership?
Well, it's both. To me, it was definitely deliberate. It was a brilliant military move for one day, but it was also really stupid. Japan's idea was that we'll bomb them so hard and scare them so much that they'll come to the bargaining table, and we'll get to split the hemispheres. We'll take Asia, we'll take over here, and you can have over there. And that was a miscalculation, and that their war games constantly told them it's a terrible miscalculation. We're going to lose in the long run if the war doesn't end within 2 years. We're cooked because we won't have any natural resources. We won't have the manpower. We won't have the things we need. And Yamamoto, the guy who planned it all, the brilliant strategist who planned it, said, I'm doing it because I've been commanded to do it, and I'm going to do the best plan I can. And Tokyo is going to end up in ashes. So He was right.
You know, we often point to the Japanese militarism behind this road to war, which culminates in Pearl Harbor. But were there moments where the U.S. internal politics mattered just as much as Japanese militarism?
Oh, sure, because FDR there was a strong isolationist faction in America during the 1930s. There was a strong anti-war faction because of the horrors of World War I, which were vivid in Americans' minds back then. Why should we go to war again to save somebody else's skin in Asia or in Europe? So Roosevelt and Hull were constantly trying to figure out how to respond to these Japanese depredations and aggressions, which also surprised me. I had no idea there were so many Japanese bombings of American properties in China, of schools, hospitals, private property. The USS Panay, an American gunboat on the Yangtze, was bombed and sunk by the Japanese Air Force in 1937. Gru thought, I'm packing. I need to go home and I need to pack because we're going to declare war and I have to get out of here. So there were all these things that were happening in Japan that the U.S. was trying to respond to. And there were also, as you just mentioned, all these currents in the U.S. that FDR was trying to work on. And Hull and FDR were also very concerned that we had let our military go to pot. We didn't have a decent Navy. We didn't have an army. And so they were slowly trying to build up those forces before we did something so foolish as to help Britain or enter into any sort of conflict with a major power like Japan, which had the biggest army in the world at that time.
The failed summit looms kind of large in this story. Do you think that was like a last real off-ramp to war, the failure of this summit, or the train already kind of passed the point of stopping? War was inevitable.
Boy, that's the $64 billion question. I guess you're referring to Prince Konoye's invitation to meet privately with Roosevelt. Prince Konoye was the prime minister of Japan. This was in late summer, August of 1941. And he floated this idea through GRU to FDR. He agreed to meet FDR any place he wanted on U.S. territory. No Japanese prime minister had ever left Japan. GRU kept trying to impress upon Hull and FDR that this is an incredible offer. And he's willing to, he wouldn't be making it if he didn't have in mind serious concessions, serious compromises, because he can't do this and come home to Japan with nothing. Because of face, for one thing. In other words, this is serious. Please take it seriously. We can possibly avert war if you will talk. And by that point, Hull was so fed up with the Japanese that he killed it. He smothered the baby in the cradle. And didn't ever allow this meeting to take place. What would it have mattered? It certainly would have delayed war for a while. Whether it would have delayed it inevitably, I don't know. But Konoye had the agreement of the Japanese military, Army and Navy, to take this meeting, to do this, to try it. And then when the U.S. rejected it, that's when the planning got very serious about Pearl Harbor. We're going to start picking a date.
I'm almost curious, even with having that permission, what was the impetus behind giving him that permission? Was it just to buy more time, right? One of these great what ifs in history. I guess we'll never know.
That's true. Right? It could have been a ploy by the Japanese. That's certainly, Hull thought, well, that's what they're doing. They just want us to talk while they keep building up armaments, which they did, which was true. On the other hand, they did have a ship ready to take Konoye wherever Roosevelt wanted to meet. And Konoye even suggested, or maybe it was Roosevelt, they were going to meet in Juneau, Alaska, to talk about this. It's one of those things you tear your hair out when you're reading about this as just a person, an American. Why didn't we at least try it? And that's what GRU was saying. What do you have to lose? Go talk to them. And Hull said, well, no. And so that was that.
You kind of bring up this point, as authors doing research, there's often, if you're lucky, there's a lot of those aha moments, but there's always at least one when you're doing research for a particular book. Can you think of like an aha moment? Or maybe you just mentioned it already, this idea of where you're doing this research and you're like, it almost like stopped you in your tracks.
Well, that certainly is a big one. That's a huge one, but there were a lot of them throughout the 1930s and first couple of years of the 1940s, where I would be reading this material and I'd be thinking, oh, surely they're not going to do that. Oh, surely they're not. That won't happen. And of course, we already know what happened. So I tried to recreate that in my book. You're just an American, and you're reading about this, and you're thinking they're not. That's too dumb. They wouldn't do that. They wouldn't bomb a U.S. gunboat, would they? Oh, yes, they would. They wouldn't start a war with China, would they? It's going to drain. Oh, yes, they will do that. Oh, they're not going to reject our explicit warning. Do not go into Southeast Asia, right? They won't do that. Yes, they will. Yes, they did. And so there's so much just as you're reading this, it's very frustrating when you think of the destruction, the hellishness that was going to come because of these decisions that are made. And that's the thing about history. It's not just this rational plan and people go along. No, it's all these passions, emotions, bad decisions, bad luck, near misses. And when you can recreate that in a book and make people feel like they're living through this again, that's what I try to do. One of the best comments I had from a couple of people was it's like a suspense novel, because it's, even though you know what's going to happen, the guy's behind the door with a knife, you keep reading because it's scary.
So how does GRU feel about the ultimate, what he sees as failure in a sense, and kind of tell us what happens to him after Pearl Harbor? What becomes of this man?
Well, of course, he he becomes an internee with everybody else in the embassy for 6 months, and then he gets traded for their diplomats, and he goes home and he rejoins the State Department, and he makes a barnstorming tour at Hull's invitation to rouse support for the U.S. against Japan. Grew was very willing to do that because he was so upset at the destruction that was happening to this country that he loved because of this fanatical group that was leading Japan into mayhem, chaos, and stupidity. And then he was acting Secretary of State for quite often because the Secretary of State would be gone. He had something to do with the response after the second bomb was dropped in Japan, and Japan said, "Well, we'll surrender if we can keep the emperor." And Gru had been saying all along, if we let them keep the emperor, not necessarily Hirohito, but just the concept with no power, they will surrender. They will not surrender if we say you can't have an emperor. And that was true. And he helped to make the response that allowed them to have this paper mache position of the Emperor of Japan. And then he was asked to go back to Japan to be MacArthur's right-hand man, and he said no. He couldn't stand the idea of going back to Japan as what it had become, destroyed, and seeing his old friends there and what had happened to them. So he retired pretty much a few days after the Japanese surrender, and started playing golf, and more golf, I should say, because he played a lot of golf. And he wrote his memoir, 2 volumes. So he stayed busy, but his career was over after the Japanese surrendered.
Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. This was really great. Thank you so much.
This was very enjoyable. Thanks for having me.